All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a wild situation, the chaotic aftermath of General Kleber's assassination and what basically amounts to a hostile corporate takeover of a 19th century military campaign. It's a fascinating look at what actually happens when grand, sky-high ambitions crash headfirst into a really desperate reality on the ground.
So, I want you to picture this high-stakes scenario. You're part of an army, trapped in a foreign land. Your leader is suddenly dead, and the new guy who steps up locks the doors and says, "Guess what? We are never leaving." How'd you react? Well, this is the exact crisis the French Army of the Orient faced in Egypt, setting the stage for literally one of the most dramatic internal power struggles in military history.
Now, we all know Napoleon Bonaparte kicked off this massive endeavor, right? But by 1800, he was long gone. He literally slipped away back to France under the cover of night. And that left the French army in an incredibly precarious spot. They were isolated in Egypt, surrounded by enemies, blockaded by the British, and completely, utterly cut off from home.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're hitting 5 key chapters: Command after Kleber's assassination, the French colony dream, the Great Project for Reform, organizing the Cairo Divan, and finally, the fierce general's opposition. We'll start with that sudden leadership vacuum and follow the breadcrumbs all the way to a full-blown mutiny.
Starting with Chapter 1, Command after Kleber's assassination, the reluctant successor. Let's look at the immediate power vacuum left by that sudden tragedy.
Okay, so looking at the timeline, what's really interesting here is that General Menou only took charge because General Rainier, a guy who was highly respected by the troops, flat out refused the job. He was terrified that stepping up would spark another bloody uprising in Cairo. So Menou becomes this reluctant successor to an army that is already completely on edge.
Moving right into Section 2, the French colony dream, a vision of permanence. This is where we see a massive ideological clash crack the army's leadership right down the middle.
This comparison perfectly captures our core conflict. Think of it like two vastly different CEOs. The old CEO, Kleber, wanted to liquidate the whole operation and go home, using the previously negotiated exit plan, the Al-Arish Treaty. But the new CEO, Menou, he wanted to double down, toss the treaty in the trash, and expand permanently to build what he enthusiastically called the beautiful colony.
You can just imagine the immense tension this caused. You've got these deeply homesick soldiers and generals who just wanted to see France again, and they're being led by a commander who is essentially burning his own ships. He's making it crystal clear that their future is in the sands of Egypt, absolutely not in Europe. Which brings us to Section 3, the Great Project for Reform, restructuring the economy. To actually make this permanent colony work, Menou needed cash, a lot of it. Enter the Great Project. Think of this as a radical, sweeping corporate restructuring plan launched in October 1800. Menou wasn't just tweaking the system. He was trying to build a self-sustaining state apparatus entirely from scratch to fund his grand colonial dream.
So the key takeaway here is that Menou actually tried to standardize the economy and crack down on widespread embezzlement. Now, doing that meant stripping power from the established Coptic tax collectors and replacing the deeply fragmented local Mamluk system with a single unified tax. It was a really bold move that modernized things, sure, but it also created some very powerful new enemies.
And the scale of his ambition was just staggering. 60 million francs. To put that into perspective, the previous administration was only managing to scrape together about 18 million francs. This new system aimed to uncover and collect a whopping 60 million annually. It was a massive financial leap that Menou genuinely believed would cement their permanent stay. On to Section 4, organizing the Cairo Divan, local administration. Because Menou knew he couldn't run a foreign land using just French military might and some financial spreadsheets. So how do you actually build a bridge to the local population? Well, by empowering local religious and civic leaders, Menou cleverly centralized his own authority while still respecting local customs. He gave these local scholars real responsibilities over daily civil life, like managing mosques and the Hajj caravan. But, and this is crucial, he kept them on a very tight leash, having them report directly to him. It was an incredibly delicate balancing act. He's trying to win over the Egyptian population so they wouldn't rebel, making them feel like they had a voice in their own affairs. But behind the scenes, Menou is quietly pulling all the major political strings right from the very top. And this brings us to the climax of our explainer. Section 5, the fierce general's opposition, mutiny in the boardroom. This is where we see fierce internal sabotage by Manu's own top executives.
Foolishness and corruption of opinion. That is exactly how top generals, like Rainier, viewed Manu's ambitious reforms. They didn't just disagree with his strategy, they fundamentally lost all professional respect for him. They looked at his great project and saw nothing more than the delusions of an utterly incompetent leader.
Just look at how quickly this situation deteriorates. It goes from a reluctant succession in June to an all-out boardroom mutiny by early 1801. Within just a few months of Manu outlining his grand vision, his own generals are actively holding secret meetings in the shadows, literally plotting to overthrow the guy Paris had placed in charge.
These generals were prioritizing their personal hatred and their desperate desire to go home over the survival of the very colony they were stationed to defend. They were actively sabotaging the whole mission. We're talking refusing to follow strategic orders, spreading vicious rumors, and writing letters to Paris to poison Manu's reputation. It was a complete, total collapse of military discipline.
What we have here is a total breakdown in communication. Both sides are completely convinced the other is committing treason. Manu sees a dangerous Clebrists cult that's ready to hand Egypt right over to the British. Meanwhile, the generals see a tyrant who's tearing the army apart from the inside. There was absolutely zero middle ground left.
So Manu strikes back. He uses informants to uncover the plot, and then he essentially fires his entire board of directors. He isolates the mutinous leaders, forces them onto ships, and deports them back to France. It was a super drastic, incredibly bold move to regain control of his army.
But, as the historical sources show us, this internal purging left the army dangerously weakened. And the timing couldn't have been worse. The British and Ottomans were closing in. Manu had secured his own position, yeah, but he had just exiled his most experienced combat commanders right when he needed them the absolute most.
It's that old saying, a house divided cannot hold a colony. Manu's great project was ultimately sabotaged, not just by the sheer complexity of governing Egypt, but by the bitter, spiteful divisions within his own ranks. They spent so much energy fighting each other that they had practically nothing left in the tank to fight the actual external threats.
So, I'm going to leave you with this to ponder. Did the French lose Egypt to their enemies, or did they lose it to themselves? When leadership fractures that deeply from within, does the external enemy even matter? It's a really striking historical lesson in how internal discord can completely unravel the grandest of ambitions. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.